Hey, it's Bram Duffee. I'd like to welcome you back to class. Today, we're going to be talking about communication in close relationships. And when we talk about close relationships, we're not talking about casual acquaintances or professional colleagues. Instead, we're referring to those deep, meaningful connections that are marked by high levels of trust and sharing and emotional closeness. These are the people you call in moments of triumph or struggle, the ones that you share your dreams with, and the ones who help you weather life's storms. These relationships that we call close relationships like this are unique because they involve high levels of openness and intimacy. So, think about the difference between what you might share with a close friend versus a neighbor that you just wave at occasionally. There's just no comparison, right? And that sharing or self disclosure, that's what sets these close relationships apart. Now, these kinds of relationships aren't just nice to have, they are actually essential. And research shows us that people who have strong, supportive relationships live longer, experience less stress, and generally feel happier. On the flip side, loneliness and isolation can take a serious toll on mental health. So, do you remember how many people felt isolated during the COVID-19 pandemic? So, with fewer opportunities for face to face interactions, there were rates of anxiety and depression that went way up. And so people craved that connection because it is as vital to our well being as it is anything else as a human that we need. And when we look at how close relationships develop, we know these relationships are important, but um, there's a way that they develop and grow. And why do we feel fast drawn to some people and not others? That's interesting. And it's where theories of relationship development can help us gain some insights. And one important theory is attraction theory. And that's something that describes the main factors that pull people together. And the first of those factors from attraction theory is proximity. And proximity has to do with physical closeness. And most relationships begin when two people are near each other. And like think classmates or coworkers, people who live or interact in a regular fashion. So historically, you had to be physically close to someone to be able to even form a bond. I guess we know that technology has changed a lot of that. And these days, proximity can also be virtual. So we do think about our online friendships or relationships that begin maybe different different through different formats. And it's true that long distance relationships can work. They often face extra challenges, especially because physical presence does play such a big role in forming these bonds. And of course, I think I think of proximity. I think of the fact that um, I know about that show Catfished, right? And that if you haven't been able to make that face to face, real live contact, that there are even technology tools out there that put up filters to make someone that you think is um, someone that they're not. So proximity does account for one of the factors. The other one is attractiveness, and it's like although that doesn't just mean physical beauty. We're also drawn to people because of their personality traits like humor, kindness, and intelligence. This is where the matching hypothesis comes in. Matching hypothesis suggests that people tend to form relationships with others who match their own level of attractiveness. So not just physically, but in overall appeal. It's why you might see two people with similar levels of charm or connected interest that have connected so easily. So it's not just that. There's another factor that's brought up called similarities, and so when we think about similarities, it's just that we're naturally drawn to people that share our backgrounds. And you ever heard of birds of a feather flock together? Like if you have the same values and the same interests, then why does that happen? And it's because similarity fosters comfort and it makes us feel validated. So, for example, if you're an athlete, you might find it easier to bond with someone who also enjoys sports. The shared experiences create an immediate kind of connection, or it has that potential for that. And that's why when we work to try to establish a connection with someone, when we first meet them, we a lot of times will dabble in bringing up different things about ourselves to introduce that, to see if they're also connected with that topic or with that interest. Forming a relationship isn't just about feeling drawn to someone. It's also about reducing the uncertainty of what kind of person they are. And that's where uncertainty reduction theory comes in. And uncertainty reduction theory is like, well, think about when you first meet someone new. Did they seem funny, or honest, or trustworthy? These initial interactions determine whether you want to develop that relationship further. And so if someone leaves a good impression, you're going to want to keep talking to them. But if they seem rude or uninterested, then you're less likely to pursue a bond. And once that initial uncertainty fades, relationships grow stronger when they meet our needs. So according to social exchange theory, we evaluate relationships based on whether the rewards that are out there, like love, support, companionship, outweigh the costs, like arguments or misunderstandings. So there is a cost-benefit analysis that's going on with the social exchange theory. And if the rewards are greater, then we stay interested. But there's a thing called equity theory. So equity theory it takes this kind of farther because it's a theory that helps remind us that fairness is just as important as rewards. So some people leave relationships not because there isn't love, but because they feel that the balance of effort there is not fair. So, for example, if you're always the one planning to do things, or you're always the one doing the initiative, or you're always the one, doing something that the other person isn't, then there's some resentment that could come in. And that resentment would be a classic case of inequity there. Now that we know how relationships start, it's like, well, how do they change? And sometimes relationships grow in predictable ways. And NAPS, with a K, KNAPPS, NAPS stage model helps us understand this process. This model looks like a staircase with 5 steps leading towards closeness and 5 leading away from it. And so when two people first meet, they go through the initiating stage. And that's like where you exchange pleasantries to make a good impression. And if they choose to keep interacting, then they enter the experimenting stage where they get used to each other on a deeper level and might share basic facts and interests or goals. And if that connection grows, then they would move into an intensifying stage. And that's where there's a relationship of closeness that becomes more meaningful. And so think about the excitement of a blossoming friendship or a romantic relationship when you start opening up to that person about yourself. And so from there, they might proceed to the integrating stage, and that would be at a stage where your lives become intertwined, and perhaps that would be a stage where you would be going to their place and vice versa, and they start introducing to other close people in their life, like family and friends, and that um, is that's an integrating stage that of closeness. And finally, there's a bonding stage, and bonding is like a public declaration time where it's like when you call someone your friend, or you get married, or it's those things of bonding are there that sort of seal that. But relationships don't always move forward, right? Conflict or distance can really push relationships into downward stages. And these could include differentiating, where people start to focus more on their differences than their similarities, And there's also a term called circumscribing, which is where communication really becomes limited to only safe, surface level topics. And if things go really south in their relationship, they might reach stagnating, and that's a little title that is really a title that means that there is no good, real exchange. And eventually, relationships like this, we're looking at a termination where the bond might end entirely. And so, does that mean if you haven't spoken to someone in 2 years that the bond is now terminated, or does that mean 3 weeks, or that it's just life is not always so tidy. Some relationships take unexpected turns, and so when you communicate with another person, that's when you can help see if you're on the same level or not. Um, there um, there are moments that can, of course, alter the course of a relationship. Like, if you have to overcome a challenge together, that's something that definitely puts you in a position to deepen the bond that you have. External competition. Um, these are all things that could change the dynamic. So we think about relationships and how they're maintained, and it's true that we've all experienced how exhilarating it is to have new friendships or romantic partnerships, because everything feels, well, fresh, exciting, effortless. But sustaining those relationships over the years or even decades is a craft that requires effort, and it requires resilience and a deep understanding of human behavior. So strong relationships don't happen by accident. And this is where looking at human behavior comes into play, because, well, what does the research show? It's simple but powerful. Good communication is the glue that holds close relationships together. So whether it's friends checking in with each other, romantic partners negotiating their individual needs, or family members maybe balancing the responsibility and care. It's just effective communication is at the heart of sustaining our most cherished bonds. And this effort to sustain meaningful connections is referred to as relational maintenance. And that's exactly what we're getting into, is relational maintenance. We'll break it down into some different practices and theories so that we can learn more about why relationships thrive and then other relationships falter. And while we're talking about this, we're going to pull from some of the psych and theories that are out there. So The term relational maintenance refers to a behavior process that's like a cognitive and an emotional process. And it's where individuals work to maintain their relationships over time. It's not enough to just, simply establish a relationship. You do have to work to protect and nurture it. And this effort includes everything from expressing appreciation to resolving conflicts constructively. And think about it in terms of an analogy. Relationships are like gardens. When you put in the initial work, planting seeds, watering them, and providing sunlight, then they begin to grow. But what happens when you stop tending to them over time? Well, without regular attention, these relationships, just like gardens, are going to wilt. And they can be neglected by the demands of everyday life and misunderstandings, or maybe even just complacency. So maintenance requires a consistent, conscious effort. And it's the same thing for us in relationships. The relational maintenance theory is something that identifies several ways that we work to sustain relationships. And these include behaviors like expressing positivity, showing support, engaging in shared tasks, staying socially connected, and being open in communication. So, for example, have you ever had a friend who regularly checks in with you just to make sure that you're okay? Right? Those check-ins, even as simple as a text or a phone call, is something that's going to help maintain the closeness of that relationship. On the other hand, when someone in a relationship withdraws, from, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, it can weaken those ties. We know that relational maintenance becomes particularly important in romantic relationships. And the couples frequently encounter what we call dialectical tensions. And that's where there are these opposing needs or desires that coexist in the relationship. And it often pulls that person in different directions. And Leslie Baxter's theory of relational dialectics provides some kind of insight into these dynamics. And so there are three major dialectical tensions that I want to explore that come from this. And you've likely encountered this in relationships. And so think about these with me. The first one is autonomy versus connection. So you have one partner that may want to maintain their independence, and then the other wants more closeness to that other. So when you look at autonomy versus connection, then we're looking at the level of intensity needing to balance. Because when you have this kind of problem where one partner wants to have their independence and the other one is trying to push their time on them, it could even make both people feel off kilter. And so one way to help that, of course, is to just openly communicate your feelings, to work to move towards a more balance. But that's one, autonomy versus connection. The other one, think about if you had relationships like this yourself, or you have seen relationships like this, where there's often this tension between wanting to share everything with your partner and wanting to keep parts of your life private. So this is another one, this openness versus privacy, where there's this tension between, having some stuff that you want to share, some stuff that you want to have private. And the third one, the third tension, is predictability versus novelty. And so when we look at predictability versus novelty, it's like while routine and stable lifestyles can make a relationship feel really secure, that's also something that can become boring. So, introducing excitement or novelty is something that might be needed. And I don't mean I don't mean any kind of perversion by that. I mean, like, you have a friend that you always go to the same restaurant, the same time, the same whatever. Maybe those things need to be sometimes um, broken up a bit so that things will become less boring. So it's like we think about not just romantic partners, we also think about close friendships, managing these tensions. And, and the answer for all of this lies in honest and collaborative communication. So, for example, if one partner craves this autonomy and the other partner wants, um, more connection, then it might help to set aside specific time so that they can do shared activities. In that way, you're able to see both of you as being able to get what they need, right? And so we think about these friendships nowadays in a really interesting way because we're talking about intimacy now, and I want to recognize with you that a lot of times intimacy has nothing to do with sex or sexual connectedness, right? So I think that there can be, but uh, also we just recognize that when we're discussing this topic, we know that there are lots of times where there's maybe like a hookup kind of culture where you go from meeting someone to like uh, to um, to a full sex, and you don't really know them yet, right? We're talking about all these stages of development and understanding and getting to know someone. With my friendships, I joke when I talk about this. I say that I don't really know that person unless I go to their house, right? Their space. I want to see where they live, right? Because that makes them real and helps me understand them. And so it's um, important to think about that as a human, we have got to have intimate relationships. And that intimacy may or may not involve sex. But more and more in our culture, it is in a special category away from sex. And so we recognize that because some people have all of their intimacy with their best friends and their um, uh, uh, sexual connectedness that has no knowledge about the private affairs. So, very interesting topic because, especially, we know that it's for some folks more uncomfortable to talk about, sharing about yourself than it is to hook up, right? So, it's really an interesting part of intimacy and relationships. Now let's get into relational maintenance because relational maintenance doesn't apply to only romantic or friendship partners. These long-term friendships also require attention. And at the same time, they face different kinds of challenges. And it's like when you move to a new city or someone starts a new job or enters a different life stage. The dynamic of the friendship might be susceptible for change. And so if you can imagine, you have two college roommates who became close friends during school, and then after graduation, one moves across the country. but both take on demanding jobs, and then at first they think that that distance won't make much impact because of technology and everything. But over time, without real active effort to stay in touch, that friendship might fade. And research does show that friendships are particularly vulnerable to passing away. And that happens through neglect rather than really active conflicts. But simple actions, it's like scheduling regular video calls or planning trips to visit each other. This is the kind of stuff that can help friends stay connected, even during periods of, well, physical distance or busy schedules. Another key theory that can help us understand long-term relationship maintenance is called social exchange theory. And social exchange theory is this theory that suggests that relationships are built on a balance of giving and receiving. And so essentially we evaluate our relationships by assessing their rewards and costs. So we ask questions like, do I feel supported in this relationship? Am I putting more effort than I'm receiving from the other person? And that's all about this balance that we were talking about earlier as well. And so when the rewards of a relationship outweigh the costs, we tend to feel satisfied and motivated to maintain it. But when the costs start to outweigh the benefits, whether it's just because of frequent conflicts or neglect or mismanaged expectations, relationships can suffer. And this is why equity theory, which is sort of a refinement of social exchange theory, equity theory is really relevant here because it emphasizes the importance of perceived fairness in relationships. Both parties should feel that they're putting into the relationship what they're getting out of it. And if one person feels under benefited, basically like if they're doing all of the effort, then they're more likely to feel resentment. And on the flip side, if someone who feels over benefited might feel guilt or a bad kind of pressure. So consider a romantic couple where one person is always initiating plans and handling the household chores and being empathetically supportive, and the other person doesn't contribute as much, right? So this inequity can breed frustration unless it's addressed. And so successful relationships often involve regular check-ins. It's like where both people ensure that the give and takes that they are doing in the relationships feel fair. And so if you aren't getting something that you need from your partner in your relationship, whether it be your romantic partner or your best friend partner, then to maintain the relationship, what we're saying here is that you need to let the other person know that you would like that from them and that you're lacking that. And that kind of open connection about your needs is a great way to help with that maintenance. So even with good communication practices and a commitment to being fair, relationships still face hurdles. And life isn't static, and long-term partnerships require flexibility and problem solving. So I want to mention a few strategies to overcome challenges that are out there in maintaining relationships. And the first thing I want to mention is that we want to think about managing conflict in a constructive way, because disagreements are natural, but how couples or friends handle them can really make all the difference. So when we use I statements, that really can help frame the communication, because it limits any blaming, right? So when you say, I feel upset when, that kind of I statement can minimize defensiveness and lead to a faster resolution. So it allows you to share how you feel, whether you're right or wrong, and just that other person hearing you out is a step towards getting through that. The second one I want to mention is expressing appreciation. One of the simplest yet most powerful relational maintenance behaviors out there is gratitude. So over time, we might forget to express thanks for what others do in our lives. And so we want to take a moment to say, hey, I really appreciate you. And that's something that can strengthen the bond significantly. Um, the other one is to think about reviving novelty. And routines can make relationships feel predictable. So injecting something new, whether it's planning or a surprise trip or something different, it can help keep things exciting. And this aligns with predictability versus novelty tension that we sort of discussed earlier. It's true that not all relationships last forever, and that's okay. I will say that some end because of an abrupt event, like a sudden death. Or if not a physical death, it could be from a ghosting. And I can tell you I've experienced both ghosting and real deaths of people that are intimately close to me, and they can feel just as powerfully painful. And when relationships end, sometimes others fade gradually, like passing away. And often endings are related to the fact that there's a lack of communication, or maybe someone feels unappreciated. Friendships might end simply because the people involved seem to grow apart. And while romantic relationships might end after maybe a conflict or some kind of autonomy or trust, the friendships can be different. While relationships can be sources of love and comfort and support, they can also become these spaces where harmful behaviors and toxic dynamics can take root. And it's important to identify and be able to address and think through these issues to make sure that the close relationships that we have are maintaining health, being healthy. So I want to mention interpersonal aggression. This includes a range of harmful behaviors from emotional mistreatment to physical violence. And that's one area we'll focus on. And we'll also talk about gaslighting, which is another form of emotional manipulation. It's a way that undermines a person's sense of reality. And by the end of today's session, I want you to have a better understanding of these psychological dynamics so that you'll have some tools to recognize and address them in your own relationships and also in the relationships of others. Close relationships, by their very nature, are deeply personal and emotionally charged. We allow those people that are closest to us to see the parts of ourselves that we might normally shield from the world. And this vulnerability can create intimacy and trust, but it also opens the door for harm when those relationships can become unbalanced. So recognizing the signs of conflict and harm early on is one of the most important skills that we can develop. Interpersonal aggression refers to behaviors that are intended to harm the other person, either emotionally or socially or physically. And this harm can manifest many different ways, like verbal insults or controlling behaviors, neglect, or outright, physical violence. Unfortunately, interpersonal aggression is something that many of us have encountered, and it's either through personal experiences or by observing it in the lives of others. But physical aggression does include acts like hitting or shoving or or using objects to harm the other person. And I know that it's one of the most visible forms of harm, it doesn't mean it's necessarily the most frequent one. Many abusive relationships escalate from little less visible forms of control into overt physical violence, and so kind of growing into that. And one common framework for understanding physical aggression, particularly in romantic relationships, is the cycle of abuse. And this cycle includes several stages that repeat over time. First, there's this tension building phase where minor conflicts and emotional strains escalate, and that leads one person feeling constantly and on like an edge. And then that might follow an incident where the aggression erupts. And then a reconciliation happens with a period of calm and forgiveness. And it's just that without intervention, this is a pattern that often repeats. And that is something that can become increasingly difficult to break over time. So we talk about this way that we see abuse. And we know that people stay in these abusive relationships sometimes because they don't think they can make it out on their own financially, or they're worried about their kids, or they're worried about the actual physical harm. So these kinds of things are important to understand, to be able to identify. And physical harm is just one form of aggression. Emotional and psychological aggression can be just as damaging. It just doesn't leave a visible scar, maybe. So emotional aggression might involve constant criticism or humiliation or alienation from social circles. It could also take the form of withholding affection as a means of controlling that other person. And this type of aggression can be particularly rough because it erodes someone's self-esteem over time. And that makes it harder for that individual to even leave the relationship. So, like, if you constantly belittle your partner by saying something like, "You're lucky I stay with you because no one else would put up with you," I mean, over time, that kind of manipulation traps the partner into an unhealthy dynamic. And so these are real life scenarios that people are dealing with in your life. And so even if it's not you, we have to be able to recognize that the people close to you might suffer from these kinds of problems. And they can happen all the way from close work relationships to romantic relationships to friendship and family. And so the other one to talk about, because sometimes it's not, it's a term that's used a lot, and maybe we don't fully understand it because we just use it so much. And so I want to talk about gaslighting. Gaslighting is an especially harmful form of emotional manipulation. It's where one person intentionally distorts the other person's sense of reality, and it makes them doubt their perceptions or their feelings or doubt their memory. The term comes from a 1938 play called Gaslight, where a husband manipulates his wife into believing that she's going insane he does it by dimming the gas lights in their home and insisting that she's just imagining the change. And so while this might sound extreme, gaslighting occurs frequently in all kinds of everyday relationships. Imagine a scenario where someone confronts their partner about forgetting an important anniversary. So instead of acknowledging the oversight, the partner responds, "I already told you the date. It didn't matter to me. You're just always imagining things." Repeating things like that lead the individual to question not only the situation, but their mental clarity as well. And so it's like repeating the false narrative. and repeating the false narrative in a way so that it is um, harsh and in your face. And that over time works to change your view. And that's over time because of how our brains work, it can work. And that's why we see these behaviors really hurt people emotionally. One of the challenges in addressing these issues is, of course, recognizing them in the first place. Toxic behaviors often start out subtly, and they can be mistaken for like a normal conflict or just dismissed altogether. But some of the red flags include behaviors like isolating someone from their friends or their family, controlling their decisions, or shifting blame unfairly. So, frequent acts of gaslighting are also clear indicators of toxic dynamics. So, to better understand these behaviors, it's important to bring in key theories from human behavior and communication. You know, um, there's a social learning theory that was developed by Albert Bandura. Bandera. So Albert explains that aggression is often learned by observing others. So a child who grows up in a household where controlling behavior or verbal abuse is normalized, that's something that might internalize because internalizing those behaviors is normal and believing that they're acceptable ways to handle conflict can happen. And so we can see that this is a thing, this communication, this behavior, it can be passed down. And this also highlights the responsibility that we have to create environments where healthy communication and empathy are modeled for future generations. Attachment theory offers another lens for understanding toxic relationships. Some people are more vulnerable to entering unhealthy dynamics because the attachment styles that they developed, which were shaped by early experiences in childhood. So, people with an anxious attachment style often tolerate harmful behaviors because they fear rejection or abandonment, and they value their emotional safety. So, relational power dynamics also play a significant role in explaining aggression. Partners who feel powerless in other areas of their life, like in their career or their social status, sometimes use aggression as a way to assert control within the relationship. And this creates an imbalance and transforms the relationship into a battleground rather than a source of comfort. Addressing these dynamics requires actionable strategies. Awareness through education is a vital first step. Many people don't realize they're in an unhealthy relationship because they've just normalized the behavior. And there are programs and workshops and discussions, well, even like this one, are effective ways to begin to learn how to identify these harmful patterns and take steps towards change. And so empowering people to set boundaries, that's another really helpful stage. You know, these boundaries that we talk about are the limits that we set for safeguarding our emotional, physical well-being. So, for instance, someone might say, I need you to stop raising your voice during arguments because it makes me feel unsafe. See, healthy relationships are characterized by this mutual respect for boundaries. And while toxic dynamics often involve attempts to sort of violate those boundaries or dismiss those boundaries, intervention is another aspect for addressing aggression in relationships. And this could include seeking help from a therapist or a support group, or even in severe cases, law enforcement. But for those who know someone in harmful relationships, if offering non-judgmental support can make a world of difference. And saying something as simple as, I'm here from you if you want to talk. That's something that creates space for the individual, enough for them to share their experiences without feeling like, without being afraid, or without feeling like they're being dismissed. At the core of addressing difficult issues in relationships is a commitment to authentic, ethical communication. Healthy relationships are built on honesty and kindness and accountability. Destructive practices like passive aggressiveness or gaslighting are things that erode trust. And we just have to work to avoid those things. And so instead of resorting to silent treatment, for example, an open and transparent approach like saying, I feel upset and I need time to process this before we talk more, that's going to be a lot more constructive. So sometimes it's just about being able to identify how you're communicating, how the other person's communicating, and being able to think through what is needed to make this work. And so it may be you need time to think about your feelings and how you want to move forward. And so expressing that makes a lot of sense. But there are lots of different dynamics to this. So if you work with me now, I guess understanding and addressing difficult issues in these close relationships, it's just not an easy process. But it is also true that it's one of the most important steps that we can take to ensure that we have healthy, loving connections. So whether we're identifying patterns of aggression or setting boundaries or providing support to someone in a difficult situation, these actions have a ripple effect on our well-being and that of others. So close relationships should be sanctuaries, places of safety, growth, love, not places of fear or instability. Close relationships aren't just about this thing we call friendship or this thing that we call love. They're about the ways that we evolve and grow as humans through connection. And so I want you to know that if there's any takeaway I want to give you today, is that relationships aren't perfect. They require effort, they require understanding, and they require communication. So when a relationship is nurtured, it's something that can truly enrich our lives. So I want to say thank you for listening, and I hope you take some time to use this to reflect on your own relationships and how you can continue building healthy, meaningful connections with others.